what I'd like to do in the presentation I'm going to give is first of all just to say a few general things about how I understand this dreaded word, spirituality, that's become such a fascinating topic these days. And then after I've clarified a little bit about how I understand the word and how I use the word, then I'll get on to the whole area of how I see connections between spirituality and our attention to healthcare, and those of us who are involved, what difference it makes to people who actually work as healthcare professionals. So first of all, just the sort of general remarks about spirituality. It's a topic, a word that seems to fascinate an increasing number of people these days. I'm aware of that here, and I'm aware of it in Europe. And it's a word that's not only frequently and increasingly used, but it's used across a wide spectrum. It's not just anymore within religious environments, nor academically is it just within kind of theological or religious studies environments, but it's a word that's increasingly used in a range of professions, which I'll talk about a little bit more, of which healthcare is one, but it's only one among many. But the part of the problem with that is that we kind of all implicitly think we know what it means, but because it's now so broadly used, it's a bit like a chameleon, if you know what a chameleon is. It's one of those animals that sits in the bushes, and it changes color depending on its environment. And I think the word spirituality changes shape and changes color depending where it's sitting. So it's becoming increasingly difficult to be absolutely precise about what it means. There's no one sentence definition. Is it distinct from religion? Some people think it is. An increasing number of people say, I'm spiritual but not religious. By that, they tend to mean that they want to distance themselves from religious institutions, about which they have a number of difficult questions. Maybe it's distancing themselves from their childhood, whatever it is. Another question, does spirituality only concern my inner experience? Or is there more to it than that? Is it just about if rather rudely, he was a Christian, but he described it as nice, warm, fuzzy feelings inside. Is that what it's about, or is there more to it than that? During the last quarter century, I guess, the word has moved well beyond its origins in Christianity, and I'll say a little bit more about that, and beyond religion as a whole. As I say, I'm spiritual but not religious. Spirituality, ooh, that's interesting. I think, is that a mystical experience? I'm not sure about that. It's now assumed that spirituality is native to everyone, that everyone has a spirituality, whether or not they have religious affiliations or not. As I say, that makes it very difficult to offer a simple one-sentence definition. But there are enough, in my view, enough family resemblances across different religions, but also across different areas of human concern, to make it, broadly speaking, understandable. And that's why I'm going to try and attempt to say something about it. One critical thing, I think, is that the notion of each of us having a spirituality or being connected to spirituality suggests that as human beings, we are, in the words of a great writer on mysticism, Evelyn Underhill, we are vision-creating beings rather than purely mechanical animals. That we seek some sense of vision, some sense of, not necessarily a kind of definitive understanding, but some kind of inspirational sense of what it would be to be fully human. And that's what we aspire to. Why is spirituality so popular these days? Number of people, certainly when I spoke at a literary festival last year in Oxford, there were a number of people thought that, in response to what I had to say, that a lot of it was a reaction against the consumerism and materialism that so dominates our lives in Western countries over the last 50 years. And apologies to anybody in the advertising industry, if there's anybody here, but a lot of people would say it's very much a reaction against the kind of model of what a good human, happy human life would be like that's so promoted by various forms of advertising. In other words, I have, therefore I am. I possess, therefore I am. I have more, therefore I'm even more. Therefore I have even more. I am even more. So I think there's something about that. Maybe that's the case. But I want to add something else, that I think the interest in spirituality also reflects the fact that traditional external sources of moral authority and social values, and I'm not just thinking of the church, and I understand the church in its broadest sense, not just the Roman Catholic Church. I work ecumenically in Cambridge with, particularly with Anglicans, you would call them Episcopalians, and a lot of my family are Anglican or Episcopalian as well as Roman Catholic, but I also have some Jewish relatives, and I work in Christian-Muslim dialogue internationally, so I have a sense of, or at least I try to have a sense of a sort of broadly based religion, apart from my own Roman Catholic roots, but that there's a suspicion that traditional external sources of moral authority and social values are no longer trustworthy. I mean, I don't want to make any comment about the current, very interesting from a British point of view, move towards the presidential elections here. But let's say the presence of, without positioning myself in any way whatsoever, but the kind of things that are coming forward there and also are present in the United Kingdom and in other parts of Western Europe, you can tell that there is, let's say that there is not a great deal of trust of what you might call the professional political class. So people who are slightly quirky, I'm not talking about whether they're on the right or the left, but people who are slightly quirky apparently are much more attractive because they're not associated with politicians. So politicians, the church, other people in public leadership are no longer necessarily automatically assumed to be the source of moral authority. We used to say professionally, medics, lawyers, teachers, politicians. Maybe 50 years ago, people looked up to them for some kind of inspiration. I think that's rather gone by the way. So, spirituality, the quest for spirituality, which can be personalized, gives me a kind of internal authority that means that I'm no longer dependent on looking up to these people who are no longer so trustworthy. Okay, so I want to just go on quickly and suggest 10 things that I think I can say about the word spirituality in general. Firstly, I'm going to list them and then say something about them. First of all, it's about aspiration. I want to reach my fullest potential. Secondly, it's about a source of values and also of authority, but authority within rather than authority derived from authority figures. Thirdly, it's originally a Christian word in which it means the opposite of being worldly. And by worldly, I mean a concern only for personal success. Fourthly, it's the true heart of all religions, but also of all non-religious philosophies in some way, even though a lot of religions sometimes seem to have forgotten that they're more concerned for institution, for buildings, for money, for hierarchies, whatever. But it is the true heart of the origin of all world religions and all great philosophies. Fifthly, there's a dimension to it that is social. It's not just about individual experience, but it's something about connecting each individual human person to a sense of solidarity with and responsibility for wider human society. And beyond that, in our current world, a sense of connection to and responsibility to a wider natural environment for which we also have a responsibility. Sixthly, it certainly involves practices. And I think we may hear something about that later this morning. Spiritual practices. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. It's not just about something in the head. It's not just about the mind. Then it's about having a self-reflective life. And in that sense, the notion of spirituality points towards the quest for some sense of meaning, but also for some way in which I can become more enlightened. That's a rather perhaps Buddhist concept, seeking enlightenment, but also towards some sense of perfection. In other words, that being human isn't just about being in the here and now, but it's also about reaching out towards some kind of ideal horizon in which I sense that my humanity can be fulfilled. It's also, I think, and because of that, it's involves some kind of movement forward. In other words, spirituality has something to do with transformation and change. It's not just about, finding a nice, comfortable spot, sitting there, and then saying, I'm not moving. It's about a recognition that becoming human is precisely becoming human, and that we're always on a road, we're always on a journey towards some horizon of ultimacy that we don't finally understand. So we take the risk, if we can become interested in spirituality, we take the risk that we might end up, feeling ourselves called to make quite big changes. And that change is towards completion, but it's also towards thriving. So we need to think about what does it mean to thrive as a human being. And of course that begins to interlock with what the whole world of healthcare is about. And again, because it's about movement and change, it's also about a sense of direction and of ultimate purpose beyond being in the moment. And finally, my last little point is that spirituality is about being holistic. That is to say, trying to come to terms with life as a whole rather than just bits of it. Okay, I'm just going to develop that a tiny bit more. So in broad terms, the word spirituality stands for me anyway, stands for aspirational lifestyles and practices that, whether explicitly or implicitly, promote a vision of human life, how to conduct our lives, and how our human spirit may achieve its fullest potential. Secondly, spirituality has become, in these days, has become a new way of finding a source of values and authority within ourselves, which doesn't mean becoming self-centered, but not depending on imposed values or imposed authority, but taking the trouble to seek to find a sense of authority and to embrace it. I mentioned that the word originates in Christianity, and then it began to move into other world faiths. At the end of the 19th century, the World Parliament of Religions, the word spirituality came up, and a quite famous Hindu Swami basically used the word, without mentioning it was from Christianity, to contrast what he considered to be the spiritual qualities of India in contrast to, he believed, the growing materialism of North American and Western European societies. He referred to India as a spiritual country. But its origins are in Christianity, particularly in the New Testament, particularly in the letters of St. Paul, where the words for spirituality, in Greek, don't mean the opposite of the body or physical, quite the contrary, but rather the opposite of being worldly. So spirituality has got nothing to do with denying the body, quite the opposite. But it is about denying that it's good to be worldly. And what Paul meant by worldly, a worldly person was only concerned with either pleasure or personal success. Whereas a spiritual person, for example, if you read Christian scriptures in the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 2, a spiritual person tries to live their lives inspired by the Spirit of God. I mentioned that spirituality is really the core, the heart of all religions and of being truly religious, even if, unfortunately, a lot of religions don't give that impression, and also of all major world philosophies and ethical systems. In other words, religion, or the great philosophies, basically are forms of spiritual vision or practice. That's what they seek to be, that are ultimately transformative if we commit ourselves to them. I also mentioned that I thought that spirituality isn't just about our own inner experiences, very, not just personal, but almost individualistic. No, I believe spirituality has a very strong social side, and that is particularly relevant when we come to think about spirituality if we're involved in the world of healthcare. And that's for that reason, I think, that increasingly spirituality is referred to in a range of professional or public worlds, particularly some of them, including politics, believe it or not, where there is a certain sense that it's lost its way, or that it's become reduced just to efficient systems. And amongst the worlds where I've discovered that spirituality is increasingly used, apart from healthcare and nursing, social work is a big one, but education, and particularly in talking about how in our schools we can nurture the spiritual dimension of the students. In business studies, is there a kind of motivation in business studies and in the corporate world that is beyond simply financial success? Amongst urban planners and urban professionals in general, that's the world that I've worked quite a bit with, architects, thinking about how do we design and plan cities or regenerate, declining cities in ways that enhance the human spirit, that aren't just, physically efficient, or provide the kind of spaces like housing that we need, but actually do it in such a way that we actually draw out, if you like, the positive side of human people who are involved with those spaces. So urban professionals. Also public policy and public leadership. There's, in London, opposite our Houses of Parliament, is a thing called Westminster Abbey, big historic church. Going back to the Middle Ages, it was a Benedictine monastery. And nowadays it's an Anglican Episcopalian church, not a cathedral, but a big church. They have a center of, kind of education center. They do a lot with people in the Houses of Parliament who are seeking some kind of resources for what they are as members of Parliament. They feel under-resourced in terms of thinking through a philosophy of life and ethics, yes, and the word spirituality appears in relationship to being involved with public leadership. Spirituality appears a lot in the arts world. My stepdaughter is a major contemporary arts curator, dealing with people like Ai Weiwei and all the rest of it. And she was saying, well, that a lot of contemporary artists view what they do as a form of spiritual practice. Whether we're talking about painting, drawing, music, whatever. Even in sports education, I recently came across a university in the UK that specializes in training people who then go ahead and train people to be good sports people. And in the sports education program, which is a graduate program, they have a dimension called spirituality and sport. And because of the various terrible things about drug taking amongst athletes or corruption in the soccer world, talking about spirituality and sport is an attempt to recover a more idealistic understanding about sport. That may be a bit counterintuitive, but there it is. There's a course on spirituality and sport in a sports education masters. But in the case of all of these things, all of these professional worlds, spirituality is a kind of value-added factor that takes us beyond the practicalities, the efficiencies, the skills that are expected of us as architects, as healthcare professionals, as sports educators. So it's this kind of plus factor. Spirituality, I think, involves, certainly, as I said, spiritual practices rather than just something in the head. And there's an immense range of spiritual practices, rituals of various kinds of meditation. See the whole popularity these days of mindfulness meditation. Amongst other things I do in life is I happen to supervise a few doctoral students in Cambridge, and two of them are Buddhist, both of whom are quite senior clinical psychologists, as it happens. But they're doing doctorates in practical pastoral theology as Buddhists. Okay. And one of them, who has just come off a term as the president of the British Psychological Association, she gets quite excited, I don't mean excited, I mean she gets quite agitated by the way that the word mindfulness meditation is used, she said, and nobody ever mentions the fact that this is a Buddhist thing. So she gets quite so when she stands up in front of her psychological colleague, she said, yes, I agree, mindfulness meditation is extremely helpful. But she said, do please acknowledge that it has ethical and religious overtones. It's not just about feeling better. There are other physical disciplines, yoga, tai chi. There's a kind of abstinence, giving up alcohol for a period, or whatever else it is. Going on pilgrimage, that's become very popular. The Camino, the famous pilgrim route across northern Spain to Santiago de Compostela. Lots of people walk that who have no Catholic, Christian belief at all. But there's something of value that's seen in actually just the physical challenge of doing a pilgrimage route and having somewhere which has meaning to which you hope you will arrive. Walking around a labyrinth. We have a labyrinth here, but all over the place. I increasingly go to institutions where there is a labyrinth, where you're invited to walk meditatively around. And a lot of these places are not religious institutions. And so on. So there are many kinds of spiritual practices. But I think the important thing is these spiritual practices are not ends in themselves or just sources of physical health or mental well-being, important that those things are. They're activities that seek to point you towards meaning. So I already mentioned mindfulness meditation in Buddhism or yoga in Hinduism. These are disciplined paths to spiritual development, to enlightenment, and also to ethical perfection. Spirituality, therefore, for me, suggests whatever world we inhabit, healthcare included, involves a self-reflective life rather than an unexamined life. Spirituality, informed by spiritual practices, is, as I mentioned, a process of transformation. It involves the risk that we may be led to change, both inwardly and maybe outwardly in our lifestyles, in order that we may more genuinely thrive. Now, this notion of transformation and change also underlines that spirituality enhances our sense of direction. Well, it enhances our sense of having a direction to go in, as opposed to just meandering through life, taking everything as it comes. There's some sense of purpose, some sense perhaps of the sacred, beyond just living in the moment. And finally, I mentioned that spirituality is holistic. That is to say, it points towards developing an integrated approach to life as a whole. Now I've got a couple of questions as a bridge towards few things I want to say specifically about healthcare. First question I have is the contemporary use of the word spirituality just about all things nice? Is it just about comfort and consolation, success, making things work well? Not least, I would have said in healthcare, is there such a thing as tough spirituality or challenging spirituality that enables us to make difficult choices in difficult situations? That enables us to confront apparent failure without falling apart? Particularly in healthcare, where obviously both in surgery and in chemical medicine, the hope is to alleviate pain or to cure, to prolong life, whatever it is. What happens when that ceases to be? Have I failed? So, does the concept of spirituality enable me to deal with, to confront those difficult situations in which my professional skills don't seem to have worked? Second question. We sometimes use the word spiritual, that's a very spiritual person, to describe people who are seen as somehow morally superior. Is that valid? Is spirituality, or being spiritual, about coming across as being slightly better than the rest of people? So if I'm a nurse or a doctor, and I'm known to be kind of interested in spirituality, is that in order that I may come across as not just as a very good professional, good at my surgery or good at my chemical medicine, but that I'm somehow in a class apart? No, that's not what it's meant, I think. My third question is spirituality detached from belief? Now, I mentioned the fact that it's no longer just limited to Christianity, it's no longer just limited to religion. It appears in a whole range of worlds that I mentioned, including healthcare. But does that mean it's detached from belief of any kind? It's not reducible to belief systems, I believe that. But I believe spirituality does imply a commitment. If I become interested in spirituality, it implies a commitment to a particular way of conducting life, whether my own personal life or my professional life. And lying behind that is some sense of a world view, that I actually see being human, both myself and the people I work with and people I work for, I have a view about what being human might mean. Some kind of vision of the human spirit and what will assist me, us, to achieve the fullest potentiality of life. And as I say, that goes back to the question about challenging spirituality. How can I think about achieving the fullest potentiality of life when I'm dealing with somebody who's dying? And I can't do anything about reversing that. Anyway, I think that some kind of belief is implicit in all fine forms of spirituality, even if it's often very implicit. Now, what about specifically about healthcare? I think spirituality, for me, points beyond a medicalized model of what it means to be healthy. By a medicalized model, and people, you professionals in the medical world, some of you might want to take me up on this and question it, but I think by a medicalized model, what I mean is that illness is a condition linked to organic disease. In a medicalized model, sickness is what falls below a professionally defined standard of acceptable bodily capacity or mental capacity or both. And here, the definers of health on the one side or sickness on the other are medics, who are also the privileged responders to that situation. Question mark. Healthcare, I think increasingly professionals that I've worked with in the UK and in Norway, for example, in mental health, increasingly argue that spirituality needs to become a key component not only of health promotion, but of training in medical and nursing schools. I found it perhaps strongest in the nursing profession, and particularly strongest in areas of mental health that deal with addiction work, and areas of medicine most closely involved in key moments of life transition, by which I mean birth and death. Hence, I've done work with palliative care specialists who are basically dealing with people who have cancer, and basically those who are, as it were, dying. Also sexual health, particularly with HIV/AIDS, where there are real issues of identity and behavioral choice that have led to the situation people are in. I've got some web links, by the way, in the article in your package to various centers, some of them based in medical schools, some not, where spirituality and healthcare are kind of the important focus. And there's a lot of resources available online, which is absolutely fascinating. You might want to, chase those links yourself sometime. Well, going back to that business about how we define a medical, or do we limit ourselves to a medicalized model of being healthy? If we get beyond that, can we move towards a more social model of health, where a person is not seen as a patient, but as a person viewed as a whole? And where we need to ask ourselves, particularly in the particularly challenging situations that healthcare professionals face in trying to care, what is a whole person? Is it simply somebody I can operate on or provide medical, chemical care that will, quote, cure them? Or is wholeness something else? There's also a whole question about the connections between the individual and the environment. In a social model of health, illness is involved with very complex causation, including context. I'll come back to that in a second. We're talking about redesigning human environments in relationship to healthcare. I think spirituality suggests that a person is a unity in themselves and in relationship to their environment, so that illness or sickness is a fragmentation of this unity. It's not just about the fact that they have a disease or that they need an operation. Being truly healthy involves the spiritual. It involves the integration of all the elements of human existence, the body, the mind, and the spirit. Well-being takes account of the totality of life. Now, within this beyond a medicalized model of health, health may nonetheless be able to include suffering because it's more than just curing. So a big question that spirituality in healthcare, it seems to me, provokes is what are our operating notions of health and our notions of healing? And how do these relate to evaluations of a truly human life as opposed to a less than human life? Somebody came up, in one of the conferences I was involved with, somebody came up with the notion of unhealth. And by that, she meant that being healthy is a holistic problem. It's not just about clinically defined illness. So, we may quote, cure the person or operate on the person, and yet there is somehow an underlying unhealth, a fragmentation in their lives. Is that my job as a healthcare professional? difficult question to face when you come to the notion of what is it to care. I found, as I mentioned, that often, and this is not to in any way diminish or demean people here who are doctors, surgeons, whatever, but I've often found that nurses, people involved in nursing, are often at the real cutting edge of some of these critical questions, because they're the people who 24 hours a day are having to deal with people in hospitals or in hospices. And they often have to deal with something that I've learnt to call, from my exposure to people who work in that area, particularly in palliative care, with what they call, well, some of them call spiritual distress, which is distinct from physical pain and isn't exactly the same as psychological disturbance. It's a kind of, if spirituality is a more than thing, so spiritual distress is also a more than thing. And many people involved in nursing that I've met would say we were never trained. In fact, this was never actually mentioned to us. Yeah, of course. Dealing with physical issues, yes. Physical pain, yes. Even dealing with psychological disturbance, yes. Realizing there's this third, slightly indefinable thing called spiritual distress, well, they said it was never mentioned to us. That people, it's not just that they're psychologically challenged, but that their whole sense of meaning, of identity, is somehow being challenged by the situation they're in. I find it very interesting that in the notion of health nowadays in the UK, where we have a national health system, which is not necessarily always as efficient as it might be, but nonetheless it does provide universal health provision, that increasingly, and I've experienced this myself personally, increasingly complementary medicine is allowed to play a role alongside classical medical treatment. So there is the availability of yoga, of meditation, massage, acupuncture. I had a particular physical condition, ruptured shoulder muscles, and apart from other medical things I was offered a kind of meditative acupuncture on a weekly basis, which I found fascinating. In British hospitals, I don't know about here, but most of them, the big ones, classically have chapels, although nowadays those have become non-denominational prayer spaces. They also have ecumenical interfaith chaplaincy teams that nowadays increasingly embrace a thing called humanist chaplains, for people who wish to have spiritual care without religious overtones of any kind. Something else that has come to me recently, the connection between environment and health. I mentioned it just briefly earlier about a more social model of health, and the fact that a person is a unity, both in terms of themselves but also in relation to their environment. It's been drawn to my attention the need to attend to a link between personal health and healthy housing, healthy streets, healthy cities. A few years back, I read a piece in the New York Times that said, you can't be healthy if your home is sick. This also pushes health beyond the eradication of disease to include the enhancement of the human spirit. I find it very interesting that we're proposing in the UK, because we're very short of housing, to build a number of new model towns in the southeast of England around London. Kind of garden cities in a kind of 19th century model, but in a modern way, 21st century way. What's very interesting is that the National Health Service has been asked to advise the architects and planners of these new towns on, from their perspective, what it means to create a health-filled environment. And this may include very practical things like making sure that housing is is user-friendly for children or user-friendly for the elderly. But it's also making sure that built into the planning is that, that people in housing should not be further than a certain distance away from a medical practice or from a hospital. Or that there are a sufficient number of open spaces, parks, water, that this must be part of a healthy environment. I find it interesting that the National Health Service is being drawn in to advise urban planners. But I've also met, talking to people who work in medical schools and nursing schools, the need increasingly to think about how we design our hospitals or our healthcare facilities more broadly. How many of them are designed or built or configured or placed geographically in relationship to a wider sense of human well-being? That goes back to that thing about the National Health being drawn in to thinking about planning these new towns, these new cities. There will also be some question about what kind of hospitals are built there. What should they look like? Do hospitals or healthcare facilities encapsulate a vision of human existence rather than provide efficient movement through a building? Are they in themselves vehicles of healing? Or are they, as I'm afraid I've experienced myself in some hospitals, terribly depersonalized, mechanized? They may be very efficient and they may provide all the spaces that are needed for surgery or for other kinds of medical care. But does the building speak to me of healing or not? And here are a few final questions, then I'll shut up. In notions of healthcare, whose life is deemed valuable and under what circumstances? A second question I have, is care or the potentiality for health a universal human right? Or is it something that is only the result of having been relatively successful, so I can afford it? How does spirituality expand and develop our notion of health? How does it expand and challenge our notion of care? Another question, what is a whole person? Is it only a cured person or a healed person? What about situations in which medicine is no longer able to work, end of life? Apart from making people comfortable, pain-free, but that's not always fully possible either, let's face it. So what is a whole person? Can a person be both whole and healed and yet dying? As a healthcare professional, do I feel when I face dying that I have somehow failed, that medicine has failed? Or do I have a broader understanding? And following that through, what kind of end can we or should we try to enable for people rather than prolonging physical dying at all costs? What governs decisions about switching off machines or ceasing certain medical interventions, chemical interventions? Is that the point at which we simply say, let's make them comfortable, but health care no longer has a role beyond making them comfortable? Okay. Do we try and prolong life at all costs because maybe we feel that if we don't, we've somehow failed or the system has failed? Going back to that word care and understanding what we mean by care, what is it to care for a person's spirit and not just for their body or for their psyche? When I talked about spiritual suffering or spiritual pain and mentioned that one or two healthcare professionals had said, well, we were never taught about that in medical school, but I've experienced what it is maybe difficult to define sometimes, but it's not the same just as physical pain or psychological problems that can be addressed by a therapist or a clinician of some kind. So what is care of spirit? And whose role is it? Do we just leave it to the chaplain? Or is it the role of a doctor or a nurse as well? Care as nurturing the human spirit. Sometimes I think we need to face the fact that our mode of care is sometimes less than fully human, less than integrated, even if it's medically highly sophisticated. That's why I say reflecting about what it means to care, or what care means, is to me, such a desperately important word. I was working with some healthcare professionals in Norway at a big psychiatric colony. By that I mean there's a psychiatric hospital, but there's also specialist centers for family therapy, for addictions therapy, for doctors who don't like to be treated in hospital with other people because they're seen as failures if they have a psychological problem. So they have their own special unit. Sorry. Very interesting. Place called Modum. You can Google it. It's a really fascinating place. But when I was there, the whole business they were talking about was the need to train, and they were thinking particularly of mental health care professionals, in the notion of attentiveness. What is it to be properly attentive? And what role does attentiveness play in an expanded, enhanced notion of care? What is a caring attitude? That's obviously another dimension. What is spiritual about all care? What is wholesome care? You know, how far are we trained in empathy as opposed to merely sympathy? And here I found a very challenging question which was bounced back to me, and I didn't have an answer to it. Is there a place for love in healthcare? Or would that be unprofessional? Well, I wasn't quite sure what to say about that, but anyway, maybe you might think about that. And that business about spiritual pain, what on earth is it? It's often recognized, but very difficult to define. And finally, I just want to end up on a note that I think some people in Europe find challenging. In the old days, we used to talk about healthcare, whether medicine or nursing or whatever it was, or psychotherapy, as a vocation. It's a very unfashionable word these days in Europe. Certain professions were considered to be vocational. Okay, but I want to get back to it a bit because it seems to me maybe it's a word we should try and use of every profession. Even banking. Sorry. Even politicians. It expresses, it seems to me, a sense of purpose that takes us beyond mechanical skills or having a good career. The notion of vocation is fundamentally tied up with the notion of service. Placing myself second, sometimes, in relationship to the needs of others, whether individually or in society. Interestingly, I have a relative in my family, who's American as it happens, from Florida, who is in the oil industry. And she said to me, she's not particularly religious, but she said to me not so long ago, lives in London, based in London and Paris, said to me, she said, you'll be amused. She said, we're going off on retreat. So I said, oh, really? She said, yes. I said, well, does that mean you're going to have to sit and do lots of meditation? She said, no. She said, no doubt there'll be some stuff like that. But she said, retreat in our world, that's the oil industry, involves how to develop a greater sense of commonality so that we have a sense of solidarity with our fellow workers. Now, she said that's partly to do with being more efficient as a business. But she said, what I think you might be interested in, she said, I was very pleased to see, is that it increasingly, even in the oil industry, means having a sense of service. That we don't just exist to be financially a successful company, and she works for Total, which is it's owned by the French government, the French oil industry, but having a sense that we also exist for the good of humanity. Ho, ho. So vocation maybe is coming back in slightly, the sense of service, that whatever world we're in, and healthcare, it seems to me, is certainly one in which there shouldn't be something we shy away from, that we are involved not just with certain skills, whether surgical or medical or psychotherapeutic, for example, or administrative, let's face it, that's also part of it, but that we're involved with a sense of service for the greater good of humanity. And that sometimes good service involves dealing with our apparent skills failure when the surgery doesn't do the business, or the drugs can't anymore prevent final death. But also service in the sense that I sometimes, even as a highly skilled professional, have to come to terms with the fact that I am second in relation to the need of